Often when I present on social and survival brain, one of the big questions I get is, okay, it's great to be in social brain, but how do I get there? How do I get out of the survival brain? Because once you start paying attention, oftentimes people drop into it multiple times a day. And I'm going to go into some more complexity in this video than I did in the prior one. So you might want to go back and revisit that exercise once you have some of the more of the background here. But in any case, at the very moment that we drop into that survival brain and need to make behavioral change, we have diminished access to our memory of the change we wanted to make and to our ability to slow down and do something different. So to work with the survival brain, you have to understand what it can and cannot do. And spoiler alert, you're also going to need some help. So the key thing to realize is that when you're in your survival brain, your capacities are very limited. It's not realistic to be like, next time something sets me off, I'm going to remember this whole presentation and like pause and be curious about the person who's yelling at me. That's just not realistic, though you can build up to it long term. But what you can do is you can swap out one very simplistic reflexive reaction for a different simple and reflexive reaction. Um, so far in this series, I've mainly talked about fight or flight, but there actually are several other very simple and reflexive reactions that a lot of people have, and that people seem to be able to do simply by trial and error over the course of their life. Freeze, that is to simply do nothing. Um, People oftentimes mistake this for something that's very sort of like low energy, but it can actually be fight and flight have failed and I can't escape. And I'm actually even more anxious and tensed up than I would be for either of those. And then there's also an appease response, fawn for alliterative purposes, which is something comes at me and I'm like, okay, I'll just give you what you want. Um, and the thing that is optimistic about the social brain is that it is, or survival brain, excuse me, is that it is trainable. So for example, I worked with a neurodivergent kindergartner who had a very hard time interpreting whether other kids were trying to play with him or physically attack him. And so in that context, his go-to response, which was a fight response, was a big problem because something very innocuous would happen and he'd react as if the other kid was trying to kill him. And by the time he got to second grade, he did develop the social brain abilities to be curious about like, well, what are their intentions really what I think? And to connect to a friend and ask for help interpreting the situation. And he had a variety of creative ways that would allow him to be safe, even if he didn't know for sure what was going on in the situation. But that took 2 years. And in the interim, what we did was very explicitly teach him that when he felt like his life was in danger, he needed to run away rather than to fight. And so he'd still go screaming across the playground, and it was a very extreme reaction, but it was a reaction that gave a lot more space to get him to feel safe and calm down and get coaching instead of having things escalate. And similarly, if you think about it, all of these survival responses are trained to some extent. Um, Newborn infants don't do any of them. They just wail. And so in order to do a fight response, you have to first learn to walk and to grab and to shove. And as kids have agency and learn that they have agency over their world, they do start experimenting with these things. But what we get consistent negative or positive feedback about really shapes which of these we lean towards. Um, Funny story, I watched this happen with my twin toddlers, because they got to that like, I'm going to get what I want by shoving my twin and grabbing their toy sort of phase. And so what would happen is that one would shove the other one, and then the second one would start wailing. And the first one would shove them and take their toy. The second one would start wailing. An adult would take the toy and give it back. And so they got into their brain that every time one of their twin would wail, they would hand them whatever toy they were holding. And, my husband and I disagreed about whether this was empathy or a reflexive appease response. But in any case, you see how those reflexes just get trained. Um, and our survival response is shaped by the feedback that we get from our environment and from our family patterns and what we're explicitly taught. So in particular, schools spend an enormous amount of energy trying to teach kids to have a reflexive appease or to reflexively comply with an authority figure telling them to do something. And we see this in adults of, an authority figure comes up and tells them to do something and whoop, reflexively comply, reflexively give them what they want. Um, we also see, especially kids who are in environments where adults can't reliably keep them safe, often find that having a reputation as someone who will fight at the drop of a pin is what protects them from victimization. That reflexive, over the top, especially fight reaction, is actually something that is effective in keeping them safe, whereas other ones are not. Um, and so what feedback built, though, feedback can change. The key is that what you can retrain your survival brain to do is what you can commit to reflex and nothing more. So what you can do when you're in your survival brain are very simple activities that you can remind yourself to do with one word. So with kids, often these are, count to 10, take a deep breath, anything that slows you down, gives you time for your nervous system to realize you did not actually die in that intervening 30 seconds. And maybe there isn't as much danger as your survival brain thought. But this is very difficult to do on your own. Our responses are trained by feedback and interaction with other human beings, and you will need other people to help you with that. Um, in particular, our reflexes are triggered by cues that tell us, often incorrectly, that we're in a situation of existential threat. Um, and any environmental cues, any bystander interventions that knock us out of that or make us think that maybe that isn't what's going on, those can also pull us out as well. So one great example from nonviolence work is someone who broke up a street fight by coming out of their house and playing the guitar because it was so unexpected that the people involved were like, what? And once they were interrupted, there was that space to resolve things. A distraction is actually a major nonviolence technique. Or, in teaching situations, the kid gets called out into the hall, they're all hunched over, they know they're going to be yelled at, and the teacher's like, so what'd you think about the game last night? And it just resets their expectations and opens up that capacity for input. So if there's a behavioral change you want to make, you can set up your bystanders ahead of time. You can tell people to remind you. You can tell them what you're trying to do because you're not going to remember on your own when that tunnel vision sets in. Um, and you might find, though, that your buddies do need to get creative because what you think is going to work when you're calm and relaxed might not actually be what works when you're under pressure. But human beings really do co-regulate, though. So if you have a bystander who can hold on to their connection and curiosity and creativity, that exerts a pull on the people around them. Though the reverse is also true. If you've got a whole bunch of people in their survival brain, bystanders are often going to be pulled in as well. And then the third thing that you have access to in your survival brain is really any behavior that you're trained in until it becomes a reflex. So the key here is that you cannot just be like, oh, I learned something once and like my brain understands it, and then I'm going to be good, because your brain goes offline when you're in your survival brain. It has to be things that you have internalized physically to the point where they are reflex and you can handle them when your memory and your critical thinking and your complex thought is out the window. So you look at things like mindfulness practices, which are very, very much something that helps people avoid dropping into their survival brain in the first place. And the key thing there, and the reason that I'm not going into like a quick step of like, well, just do this, is because it has to be a practice. It is something that you do and internalize over time, and you're going to need access to a group of some sort of people who are going to support you in doing that like training over time. But mindfulness is very much something that you see in this space, it's helping you stay out of your survival brain. Also, other forms of training that we see, just for example, these are things that get trained until they become a reflex, but martial arts and self-defense classes do a lot of work with training survival responses. And these are interesting because the biggest impact is often not actually ever using the physical skills. I work with a lot of nonviolence things, and training people in self-defense actually can be a very, very powerful support of nonviolence, not because they ever go and punch someone, but because it changes how people use their survival brain. Um, and what reflexes they apply in social situations, which is where most of our survival brain triggers are. So, feminist self-defense classes, for example, focus on having the right to set physical boundaries and to defend those boundaries against boundary violations. And participants tend to report that they're much less likely to use freeze or appease when their social boundaries are invalidated or violated. And they're more likely to either reflexively push back, no, I don't want you to do that, or to find a way to leave the situation. And that's actually oftentimes where the biggest impact is. Similarly, like I trained in Aikido for 15 years, and for me, the biggest impact, I never used the skills physically, but I was able to stay calm and not feel threatened for much, much longer than I otherwise would have, so that I could use my social brain to work with the kid rather than being like, I am under threat, I need to bring the hammer down. The key here is that the amount of practice and feedback that it takes for something to become reflexive enough for your survival brain to access it is way more than we might expect. But if you do get that kind of training and practice, the reflexive skills that you can have can be quite complex. So if you look, for example, at military personnel or first responders, these are people who are in literal situations of physical survival who are doing extremely complex tasks by reflex. But it also took them years of training and years of very deliberate training and practice to be able to get to that point. And so when we think about the applications of that for an organizing perspective, what you really have to do is you really have to be deliberate about training the response that you want. It's not just going to happen on our own. Those four fight, flight, freeze, appease are the ones that we tend to come up with when we are just figuring stuff out on our own in our current environment. If you want something other than that, you can retrain it, but you're going to need practice and feedback. And the simpler the replacement behavior, the less practice and feedback you need. Obviously, the more complicated, the more practice and feedback. But for any skill, you're going to need a lot of low stakes, realistic opportunities to practice. You're not going to make complex behavioral change your first try in a high stakes situation. That just sets yourself up for failure. But with that said, it can be very much worth it to really take a look over what are my responses and is that what I want? Because oftentimes in an education setting, we tend to focus on the fight response as the most problematic one and like try to train a kid to do something else. But in an organizing context, like I guess that, you don't want to be triggered and go punch the other side. That's not going to get you what you want, kind of thing. But you might also want to look at those flight and appease responses or freeze. And you might find yourself being like, you know what? I actually really don't like it that I freeze in these situations. I want my reflexive response to be to whip out my cell phone and start recording. That's at least a step up. Or you might be like, well, my reflexive response is to appease. And actually, I think I should do nothing instead of appeasing. And as someone who's, struggled with that, myself, I'm like, you know what? Being able to stand here and not nod my head and act like it's okay, actually, that's a victory. So I think those things over. There is also just some things that you can do just to avoid getting into survival brain in the first place. And a bunch of it is really what we've talked about. It's knowing what your go-to response is, so you recognize it, and then backing it out a little bit. What triggers it? What can I experiment with that will let me try different things earlier and earlier in the process? If we think of the core of the social brain as being connected and curious and creative, that's what you're using to approach yourself with instead of bashing yourself or avoiding thinking about it. Because if you want to slow down and connect and do things differently, there really isn't a way to do that without slowing down, connecting, and doing things differently. We really want to have that just like, oh, just give me the quick answer and then I'll be done. And it's really not how it works, unfortunately. These connection, curiosity, and creativity are also the go-to words for working with other people. You cannot use your survival brain to force someone out of their survival brain. Human beings co-regulate too strongly. if you want to get people out of their survival brain, the number one thing that you have to be able to do is to model what it is you want them to do, to be able to hold to that social brain, to be able to hold to that connection, curiosity, and creativity. Um, there's a little bit of complexity here because what you can do in your survival brain, so for example, like shouting at kids, for example, is you can sometimes trigger someone to go into freeze instead of fight or flight, for example. Um, and sometimes you can trigger an appease response, but those responses, those reflexive responses are not getting people where we need them to be long term in order to build the movement of change that we want. So what I urge you to do is really, if there's one thing that you can hold on to, it's that connection, curiosity, creativity. Put that on your fridge, put that wherever, remind yourself of it, repeat it, find the cues in your life that will cause you to be like connection, curiosity, creativity. Because of this entire presentation, those three words are the most that you're going to be able to hold on to once you get into that survival brain. If that, possibly not even that, possibly just cell phone. Record might be as simple as it gets. We really do lose access, like I said, to a lot of those things that we have access to in our social brain. So for our exercise for this one, what I encourage you to do is just think about it. What are your go-to survival brain responses? When are or were they useful? When are they not? And I do want to name that it is important to recognize that some of these survival responses are adaptive, especially in certain situations. Or if not now, they were adaptive when we were younger, or we inherited them from our parents and they were adaptive in our ancestors' lives. And it's often easier to let go of a behavior if you can honor the part of you that is afraid to let it go. And I also want to be clear, since this is a common miscommunication or misunderstanding, that using your social brain does not mean you are avoiding all conflict. That's a flight response, actually, to run away from conflict. And it's not never getting angry. But there is a difference between I'm angry because I know that you can do better and I expect more of you versus the I'm angry, so I'm going to stomp you into the ground so you never get up again. The former is actually a very connected one. It's an anger of connection and demanding better. And the second is an annihilate, I'm going to crush you response. And so that's a difference where you can see something in the social brain versus a survival brain, even though it's both anger. And avoiding a conflict or looking away or giving in is just as much a reflexive, unthinking response as lashing out can be. One additional tiny complexity is that the physical actions that the survival brain does can also be deliberate ones that are done for a thoughtful reason. So, for example, a flight response, what is a reflexive flight response versus a strategic withdrawal? Those can be hard to tell apart from the outside. The things to really look for are where are those things where it's tunnel vision, where it's reflex, and where there is thought that is either rationalizing after the fact or simply not there. So I'll let you do that exercise and then see you for the next video.